The second larger scale consideration we're going to talk about as it pertains to surveys and questionnaires is question wording. And so what's going on here is that when you're writing questions, it turns out that if you have a poorly written question for a variety of reasons, which we will detail momentarily, you can get unreliable data. And of course, we know if it's unreliable, it's invalid. Sometimes you could still get reliable information, but it would still be invalid. And essentially, what's happening is that people are responding to different elements of the questions, which are not what you may have intended. And that's really the problems. And one of the bigger problems is if you have an issue here and you can't pick up on it, you could make some fairly strong conclusions based on highly invalid measurements. So you really do have to be careful when you're wording questions. Generally refer to this as context effects, the idea that there are things other than what you're intending to ask about that people are responding to. So here's just a very brief example. You may know what these two items of food are. They are hamburgers, but they're not just hamburgers. They are very specific hamburgers. You may recognize the one on the left as a Big Mac from McDonald's, and you may recognize the one on the right as a Whopper from Burger King. When I was a kid, it was always the case that, and it's less so now probably, that they would each put commercials on saying some version of the same thing, like the Big Mac, America's favorite burger, or the Whopper, America's most sold hamburger. And even as a kid, it didn't take a lot of thinking to be like, well, that can't be right. Like somebody's got to be the best, right? How's that work? And after you learn a little more and you take a research methods class, you figure this out. So here's how this works. They ask survey questions, and as you might guess, the survey questions are worded in a way that might change the nature of the responses. So here is a question. Do you prefer your hamburgers flame broiled or fried? Okay. And when you ask people this question, 75% of people prefer it flame broiled and 25% prefer it fried. And this is, of course, exactly what Burger King does. They flame broil their food. And I gotta say, flame broiled sounds nice. It sounds extra fancy. Fried is just kind of but flame broiled is like, oh, we're taking care. We're thinking about how to cook it. It seems special. It doesn't seem like a word you hear all the time. And so people generally respond to that. Well, McDonald's would say two can play at that game. And here's a survey question they might produce. Do you prefer a hamburger that is grilled on a hot stainless steel grill or cooked by passing raw meat through an open gas flame? If you ask this question, 85% want it on the hot grill and 15% of people want it through the gas flame. This is great news for McDonald's because that's what they call grilling. Now, what's happening here? Well, they, instead of like the previous question where grilling sounds kind of and like not so great, they're using some words here that make it seem really exciting. It's a hot grill, it's stainless steel. I guess that's good for grills. I don't really know, but it sounds like it's good for grills. And I think more importantly, what they're doing here is they've described flame broiling in a very unique way. They refer to it as cooking by passing raw meat through an open gas flame. Now, folks, I hate to break this to you. This is what cooking is. You take raw meat and you put it on a grill, you put fire to it, you put heat to it, and it gets cooked, and that's what makes things taste good and not get you sick. That's cooking, right? But the image, the way they phrased it, the image you get is like some guy with a meatball and a Bunsen burner in your chemistry class, like like a s'more, like a like a meatball marshmallow with some guy like passing it through a Bunsen burner until it's done. That's flame broiling, technically, but when you phrase it that way, it doesn't sound so appetizing. And so this is how companies can do it. They very cleverly, and in some cases I would argue intentionally, word things in such a way that they get the response they want, as opposed to an accurate response of what people really desire or what people actually like better. And so when we break this down a little further and we talk about common problems in question wording, we could talk about leading questions. So leading questions are when the wording of a question suggests only one answer to the survey question. So for example, you might get something like, how excited are you to try our new product? And they might give you a scale like 1 to 10. The problem with this question is that it prompts you to immediately think about being excited. It doesn't even let you have the idea of not being excited. It assumes you are going to be excited, which may not be the case. But when people are reading through a survey quickly, this sort of phrasing will elicit a positive response from them because you've led them to that positive response. The way to fix this would be to say something like, how excited or not excited are you to try our new product? And in that way, you balance it. You put in the respondent's mind both being excited and not being excited. Those sort of cancel each other out, and then you can get a truer, more valid estimate of how they feel about your product. You can also get something like loaded questions. So loaded questions are when the wording of a question uses powerful language that has clear positive or negative connotations. So again, we're using words in the question that produce strong feelings that lead to a certain response. So here's an example. Do you think the government will ever seriously look into proven practical and effective methods to lower vehicle emissions instead of resorting to raising yet more cash from drivers? This is a loaded question. And the way you know this is you can look at the words, right? Or the phrasing. So, will the government ever seriously look into? That's clearly a person who thinks not favorably about the government. They are biasing their opinion on vehicle emissions by saying practical and effective, obviously highly positive terms. And then again, more negative here in terms of resorting to raising. Resorting is a very powerful word that has a lot of connotations that are not good. When people resort to something, they're generally up to no good. Also, by the way, just using a term like the government is a loaded term. Generally speaking, people don't like the government. Um, you know, regardless of who you vote for, there's always this sort of like, I wish the government would do more. So the government's approval ratings are always kind of bad. And so by using the word government in there specifically, you have biased the answer already. And so the way to undo this is make sure your language is non-emotional. We could ask this question without mentioning the government. And we could do a couple other things to get a more valid answer here. You can also find double-barreled questions. A double-barreled question is when a survey asks a question about two different topics in one question. And the issue obviously becomes, for any given respondent, you're not sure which barrel or which question they're responding to. I think the assumption is, if you analyze data from a double barrel question, is that there is implicit agreement between the two, but that doesn't have to be the case. And if it's not the case, then one respondent might be responding to the first question, while the second respondent might be responding to the second question. You're treating that data like it's all the same, yet it's clearly not. So here is one from a old institution I was at, where these were part of the course evaluation surveys, and it says this professor encouraged discussion and/or answered students' questions. So if the professor, did both of those, okay, maybe they could respond the same. But of course, as the person looking at the data from an anonymous survey, you didn't know that. So let's say you had a professor who was bad at discussion, but did a good job answering students' questions. How are you going to respond to this? It's very tricky. The problem is that the participants will still respond. They will still come up with something to tell you. And if you've written the question in such a way that it's double-barreled, it'll essentially be not interpretable. You won't even know what to make of it. So this is why you should break this one into two separate questions. The professor encouraged discussion, that's one question you can evaluate, and then the professor answered students' questions. That's a second question you can evaluate. Other things to think about here, you want to be careful for unclear wording. If you can, kind of like we talked about with informed consents, you want to use a 4th grade reading level or as simple as terms as possible. The more complicated the words, the more confusing it gets, and the more confusing it gets, the more variable the answers, the less reliability, because some people will know what you mean, some people will not know what you mean, and so you want to keep it as basic as possible. Short questions are better. Long questions can be problematic. You can lose people from the beginning of a sentence to the end of a sentence, so you want to make these things as succinct as possible. And you rarely, although sometimes you can, rarely use negatively worded questions because those are very, very confusing for folks. Here's just one example of this. I was at an older adult's house, someone in my extended family, and I was helping them with something at their house. And on the fridge, there was a do not resuscitate order, which is something that older adults, especially living by themselves, may have in case there's a medical emergency. And it tells the folks who arrive on the scene whether they want to be resuscitated or do not if they find them, let's say, without a pulse. And this is what it looked like. It was said do not resuscitate order, and then there was 2 boxes that were checked. One said I do, one says I do not, and then it says want a do not resuscitate order. So if you're a medical emergency personnel individual coming into a house, you see this and it says, let's say it says I do want to do not resuscitate order. That's going to take you a second to figure out what exactly that means. And perhaps more confusing is the I do not want a do not resuscitate order. Like, you're going to stand there for a minute being like, what am I supposed to do here? You might not even be able to figure it out. Meanwhile, if the person does want to be resuscitated, you're wasting valuable time, right? So there would be a lot clearer and simpler ways to express something like this by not using the negatives and certainly not using the double negative. And that's something that we should also do in our own survey questions when we're writing them. So as a last little example here, this is a nice little exercise to give you some practice with. There are 5 items here that you can take a look at and practice with by identifying the problem. You could also reword the question to see if you can fix it. I would pause the video here so that you can try to figure out the answers, and then I'll wait a second and then I'll tell you what the answers are so you don't have to live with the ambiguity of not knowing. Okay, so the first one, are you satisfied with the pay and benefits at your new office? That's double-barreled. Pay and benefits are separate, so you might feel differently about each of those. Do you agree or disagree that teachers should not be required to supervise their students during recess? That unnecessary negative. It would be a lot simpler if you just said should be required. That would be a better way to do that. Are you in favor of allowing construction union czars the powers to shut down an entire construction site because of dispute, forcing more workers to knuckle under? This is a loaded question. There's a lot of heavy terminology here. Czars, forcing, knuckle under, very strong terms that people respond negatively to, and therefore, in this case, might agree because there's a little bit of a leading element here too. The next one about Rayo's marinara sauce, also leading. It doesn't give you the option to think it's not the best or think about other marinara sauces, so there would be better ways to do that. And then on a scale of 1 to 10, what priority would you assign the candidate to this program? There's a couple things wrong with this. The big thing for me is not something we necessarily talked about, but in this video, but in a previous video, where if on a scale of 1 to 10, what priority would you assign? You got to give me some labels here. What does 1 mean? What does 10 mean? Is 10 mean highest priority or lowest priority? Is 1 the best or the worst? A person without those labels would have no idea what to do, but would respond anyway. And 2 separate people or 2 separate groups of people might interpret that scale differently. And you might get drastically different results based on people's version of, how they think the scale should work. And basically your data will be very messy and you won't actually know what people really want. So those are some good examples of survey wording problems.